Well, thank you so much, Shan, for being with me today on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. You are my 90th guest on my podcast. How are you today, Shan?
I'm good. Wow, I'm honored to be number 90.
Yes, milestone number 90. I've been watching your commentary on CNN for years, and I wanted to go over your background for my audience at home. You were a former judicial clerk for the Honorable Jerry L. Buckmeyer, another judicial clerk for the Honorable Eugene A. Wright. You worked at the U.S. Department of Justice, first counsel to the Attorney General, and then assistant U.S. Attorney. You were the owner and partner for 3 years at Wheat Woo PLLC, an adjunct professor for 2 years at George Washington University, a member and partner for Wu and Grahovsky PLLC, legal analyst for CNN as I came to know you and admired all of your legal commentary. And I've had other legal analysts from CNN on my show, which again, thank you so much, Shan, for being here. You are a partner at Cohen, Seglius, Paulus, Greenhall, and Furman PC, recently a member of McGlinchey, Stafford, and now you are the founder, and you've been the founder, I should say, for the last almost 16 years for the DC Student Defense. So when you think of all your experiences, Shan, when you think of relationship building in a team environment with all those experiences that I shared just moments ago, when you think of relationship building in a team environment, what does it mean to you and what has it meant for your professional career?
I think I was thinking about this topic before we're going to speak today. And one thing that's really interesting is the physical environment has changed so much, probably in all professions, but particularly in the legal profession, from a time where you, of course, went into the office, worked with people there, to an environment now, certainly after COVID, of much more remote, not only for big firm practices, but for what I'm doing now, which is really solo, small type firm, it's almost entirely remote, everything that we do. And so in thinking about that, I think the fundamental ways that you relate to people remain the same. And that, I think, is when you have to know who you go to for different types of questions and who's the resource for the right area. We can talk about this more, but when I was counsel to Attorney General Reno, I really got a sense of how large DOJ really is with that kind of bureaucracy. And there's a whole bunch of things you have to figure out. Who are you going to? Who do you ask questions to? And who can ask you questions? Down to the real micro detail of the daily law practice for me, which is almost completely remote. I mean, there's nobody sitting in the office with me. I don't walk down the hall to chit chat. And so the basics, I think, it's really about knowing who your teammates, who your support people are, and understanding their strengths and which areas you want to ask them to work on, and which areas you got to think through, is there somebody else that I should work with on that? And the other thing I've really tried to do over the years is to ask people to give me that feedback, which is, are they the right person? I like to use the word guidance a lot when I reach out to people I work with, people I'm kind of cold pitching, is I'm asking them, looking forward to getting your guidance on this, because I think that's the real key to it, is to ask people to help you navigate through questions, through projects that you're working on. So I really think those are kind of like two key things.
And really going back to the earlier parts of your career, I mean, when you were first starting out, what in your mind, what were the deciding factors in wanting to pursue a career in law? And I mean, you have such an incredible background, and to say that you worked with, former Attorney General Janet Reno during the Clinton years, talk to me about those experiences and what it was like working for the Clinton administration. I've had some President Clinton alumni from that White House on my show, so I'd love to learn more.
Sure. Well, I chose law really. I like to joke that the stereotype about Asians being good at math, I was not very good at math. So medical school was not an option for me. But since I was a kid, I really enjoyed arguing with people, sort of like learning different sides of a topic. And my parents were political refugees from mainland China after the Communist Revolution. So I think I kind of grew up with a mindset appreciation of the freedoms in the U.S. My dad was pretty active in the Chinatown community. He'd been a human rights commissioner in New York City. So I did have this sense of using the law to protect people and to protect people's rights. So I was interested in it, certainly from that standpoint. I started out as a prosecutor, line prosecutor, before I became counsel to Miss Reno. And so that was day in, day out. You're doing street crime. In DC, it's an unusual place because even though it's a federal prosecutor's office, we do all the street crime the way a local DA's office would do it. So there's enormous volume day in, day out, a lot of relationship building with the people on the team, detectives, other prosecutors, etc. And it was very interesting because at the end of that was when I became counsel to the Attorney General. So I got to really see from the top down how that large organization worked. And I think what really struck me the most about that, and it's particularly timely because of the difference of what's going on today, is just how independent the Justice Department was and what the mindset was there and how worried people were about making sure that it didn't ever look like or sound like that we were asking the political wing, meaning the White House, for direction on what to do with things. It was very high consciousness of that. And I think that really struck me when I got there because I had sort of had an idea that, oh, at the top levels, the Attorney General probably chats with the president and other cabinet members. It was very, very controlled, limited interaction because there's such a concern about it seeming to give the impression that it might be affected by a political agenda and not to make same thing with members of Congress. I mean, there's constant reach out from Congress to DOJ, but there's always very much of an arm's length relationship to there. And when a congressional referral would come in, even I tell this with a little bit of humor to it. I mean, there's a little bit of a looking at it a little bit askew with those. We took it with a grain of salt as congressional members saying, take a look at this matter. It's possibly criminal. Always polite. They get the response, but internally it was kind of like, that's something we're going to decide, not be affected by Congress. So I was very much struck in my time in that area of the administration with just how concerned everybody was to avoid the appearance of there being a political agenda.
And how concerned are you now seeing that President Trump, not only in his first administration, but now during the second administration, things have increasingly, even from that time, fast forward to today, where things have gotten a lot worse in terms of us seeing, and as Americans, we see it. We see that there's a partisan Supreme Court. And yes, it's a 6-3 majority favoring conservatives. And we've seen partisan Supreme Courts in the past. I mean, we've seen where, there may be at times more liberals, there may be times where there's more conservatives, but President Trump utilizes the Supreme Court like it's like his own law firm. And anytime there's contentiousness or anytime that there's disagreements between Trump or amongst Trump and others who he wants to go out and sue, he'll, make sure that any case that he wants to put before the Supreme Court is really for personal purposes. And it becomes like a full spectacle for us Americans at home. I mean, how concerning is that, Chan, when you see a president, go after law firms or go after political opponents or go after universities? And we just recently saw it with Jimmy Kimmel, where, forcing ABC, and I know about the merger that's trying to take effect with Nexstar and Tegna. But in terms of Jimmy Kimmel being off the air for 6 days and then coming back on the air, Donald Trump has been, somebody who has really, with his policies and the way that this administration is running, it's infringing on our freedom of speech. It's infringing on a lot of our rights as Americans, and really, putting to test our nearly 250 years of this great grand experiment called American democracy. So would love to get your thoughts from a legal perspective on all of what we're experiencing in 2025 and even years leading up to now.
Well, I think that the situation we're in is one which took a lot of time to get to. Actually, I think Trump is perhaps an accelerator for this and disruptor a lot of things. But for example, the Supreme Court, to follow up on that point, we did not get here overnight where there's a 6-3 majority. The conservative movement, the Federalist Society, did a really great job of building over the decades. The strategy was you need a really big pool of conservative judges. Sorry for it to trickle to the top so you can get a conservative Supreme Court. And they spent a long time doing that, mentoring young conservatives, pushing them towards judgeships, pushing the scholarship. And so that eventually bubbled up into this potential scenario. And it was by no means guaranteed. I mean, they could have lost several key elections. They wouldn't have had the votes to put in those justices, but they laid the groundwork for that. And so it took really decades for it to come to this point. And certainly, Trump took advantage of having the presidential office and having this big pool of conservative talent he could pick from. And that fulfilled sort of a goal that they had done. But I think it's really important for, us to remember that, and for your viewers to remember that it didn't just happen overnight. I mean, you can have a lot of, dislike of the individual conservative justices if you disagree with them, and that's fine, that's all right. But it's not like they just appeared, like some one bad apple got picked and put up there. It was the culmination of a long time in planning. And I think that's what's really important for people to think about as we look at what I consider to be a stress test of the sort of principles of government, the institutions that have built up. It's a stress test that is showing a lot of fractures. And I don't know that we're necessarily succeeding in a stress test, but the reason for stress tests, why they're useful, is because they show fractures, not just, oh, we did great, we passed it here, but you want to look at the fractures that are here and see what can be done going forward. And the fractures are very big. I mean, they're divisive, they're very dangerous. People are being hurt, people abroad, like just using the foreign aid as one example, people will die or are dying from this. And it's a very serious matter. But I think there is an opportunity to look at where these problems are. Some of the problems, maybe you fix them by a new law, new legislative proposal. But the crux of fixing it, if you think there's something that needs to be fixed, is really in the attitude of the people, in the understanding of the voters, and what needs to be paid attention to. And I think that's really what these two terms with Trump have really brought us. Certainly, the direction that he goes in, I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer that he is very fixated with authoritarian type imagery. I don't know that he studies history and says, I'm going to model myself after Mussolini or anything like that. But his tendency, like those people, has been he really wants to dictate what people think, what they can do. And increasingly, I think as he feels more powerful in this term, it's very much like your real crime is disagreeing or criticizing me. And that's such a classic dictatorship type of mentality, is you cannot make fun of Jimmy Kimmel. You cannot question anything about the leadership. And that's certainly a very, very dangerous road to go down on. I mean, America, as you're saying, has had, a couple of centuries where these institutions have built up some foundations and walls in people's attitudes and the institutions. It's not crumbling overnight. There's a lot of legal pushback to it, but it is a very, very dangerous period. And, like I said, it's a stress test, and the fractures are showing.
And you speak about fractures, and I think that's really helpful for my audience and me at home, because fractures, we understand what fractures are. There's fractures in different contexts. So it's bone fractures. There are fractures within a society, as we're talking about right now, or within a political party. And we've seen them throughout political movements, how, my previous guest, Joe Walsh, were talking about how there was a fracture within the Republican Party 20 years ago with the Tea Party movement, a movement that he was a part of. And now he, in the last 3 months, has become a Democrat. But that was, a process over time, right? And we talk about the fractures, or you talk to me about the fractures, and I believe that these fractures are irreparable. maybe not from a legal standpoint, because you talk about the pushback legally. You have district courts and appellate
Right.
courts, and I mean there are a lot of courts around the country, and some are lean left and who are not afraid to push against the current president, just like the first administration. But even if we're able to survive, Shan, from a legal standpoint, and that our country stays intact, and thank God, that's all we want. We want to make sure that our democracy prevails and that we have our rights and we have our liberties and the ability to live in this wonderful grand experiment, the greatest experiment in the history of the world. But the erosion of public trust in our institutions, because the first Trump administration, where he was rejecting all of our intelligence agencies and really going against science and going against facts. And when I had Chuck Todd on, he had the conversation, or that interview that we all remember with Kellyanne Conway, where she comes up with alternative facts, and Chuck is like, alternative facts, those aren't facts. So
Right.
what is your thought process, putting your legal cap on, that although we can survive the fractures inside of our government from perhaps a legal standpoint, because there is that pushback, but very well how the importance of public trust, especially you being an officer of the court. I talked with Joey Jackson, another CNN legal analyst, about this, Ellie Honing as well, Jeffrey Tubin. So how do we make sure that although we can survive from a legal standpoint, how do we survive from a public trust standpoint?
I think people have to become motivated, and they have to have help in looking at what it is they think they trust about the institutions. Like the analogy to overdependency upon medications in the medical profession, which is just give me the pill for that, doc. This idea that, oh, the Supreme Court should take care of this. DOJ should prosecute this. And, while that's true, that's mechanically how it happens. I think as we're seeing this get corrupted by a president who says, don't prosecute based on the crime, prosecute based on what I tell you, people need to think about, oh, wait, that doesn't seem right. How does it work? Why does it work in the way that it does? And so most people don't think about that process, grand jury versus, the pettit jury, of what goes into a prosecutorial charging decision. There's this idea that, the cop should do what's right, prosecutors should do what's right, juries should do what's right. But I think it, particularly as commentators now, I think it's very much a unique moment where we have a chance to try and explain to people how it is that process has worked in the past, why it worked that way when we think it's working well, why it didn't work well. Lots of times in the past, things were not going well at all in terms of sort of due process or justice, and to look at that historically and put it in this context here so people understand what's it mean. We've lost public trust in the Supreme Court. What does it look like to trust the Supreme Court? Do we think they just agree with my personal views? No, it's the process you want to understand and make sure that the process isn't being corrupted. So really drill down on that for 1 second. A lot of commentators have pointed out that this overuse of the so-called shadow docket, which is really just their emergency orders docket, it doesn't go through the full briefing process, doesn't have this percolation period of litigating through the district courts, appellate courts. It goes kind of like right to them. That is a recipe for bad decision making. These 9 people who sit there, liberal or conservatives, they are not like the super best legal minds in the country. They just happen to be on the Supreme Court. There's nothing like metaphysically better about them that they can understand these things instantly. That process is important. Let it percolate, let it get argued out, let other people think about it. And that's something that I try to really emphasize a lot when we talk about the Supreme Court, is what's really going wrong. It's not just we don't like their decisions, that Alito, likes to put on a pedestal some guy from the 17th century who was like a witch hunter kind of thing. Yeah, I don't like that. What as an institution were the guardrails, and why are they there? What can we say about them? So I think we really have to think about what allows us to trust the institutions, to think about how we repair that trust.
Do you think that because there's so much political pressure for them, given that it's a 6-3 majority, and given the fact that the MAGA movement under Trump, or, Trump is a fascist. I mean, he has authoritarian tendencies. And I think that it's not a problem to speak it out loudly for the purpose of this podcast, or even in interviews, whether it's on CNN or other places, because I really believe that it's not just one person's opinion versus another person's opinion. I mean, there's many of us who believe what Donald Trump is, showing the world. I mean, he exudes this divisiveness of his ability to divide rather than unite. And he doesn't really care about anybody but himself. And he is so self absorbed, and he has those narcissistic qualities, and he has some type of neurotic behavior where he has to have it in a certain way, and whether he's telling the truth or not, and the vast majority of the time, I mean, probably all the time, he's not telling the truth. So people now, and we talk about that public trust, they look to the Supreme Court to say and rule whether the Trump administration is right or wrong. But I believe that I saw recently that the Supreme Court, since he took office for a second time, that they've ruled in favor for him the vast majority of times. So therefore, given that known fact, is the Supreme Court catering or bending the knee to the Trump administration like we've never seen them bend the knee toward other previous presidents who are more of the typical, dignified US president who either has a military background or has political experience, knows how Congress works, and just know how diplomacy works. And because he's a divider in chief and not a uniter in chief, and because our foreign policy is completely unraveling at the seams, and he doesn't have the typical conservative foreign policy anyways, let alone what we see domestically. So in that light, and you talk about the Supreme Court in your mind, that they're not the greatest legal minds compared to others who don't hold those titles. How much do you blame the Trump administration, or how much do you blame the Supreme Court in that regard when they are being complicit? And to your point, it's not percolating enough. They're not in a state of mind where they'll take weeks and months and even up to a year or two to really, think about it, analyze it before a ruling. It's just on the fast track. And that's what my greatest concern is.
Well, I think that the Trump administration is certainly trying to be as manipulative and abusive as possible, even down to like when you see Trump greet Chief Justice Roberts by saying, thank you, you're doing a good job, like you're doing a personal favor. That's no question what their intent is. I think with the mentality of the Supreme Court in particular, what really strikes me is their sort of blindness, of the lack of self-awareness about what's going on. And again, this takes a long time to percolate. These are people who started out as young law students, developed their conservative ideologies. They are good scholars. I mean, they got great grades in law school, but they have their own mindset where it's very important to them, and they seem to genuinely believe in this notion that we're just dispassionately applying the law. It's like, the famous calling balls and strikes, and they like to use that analogy of an umpire, or that you feed the facts into the law machine, you turn the crank, and out comes the decision. That is unfortunately a very self-ignorant way of seeing what's happening, and can be absolutely extremely manipulated too, to say, oh, we're just applying the law here. It doesn't matter that, we're upholding slavery. We're just applying the law in this instance. That, I think, really needs to be made public. Light has to be shown on that process, that it's not like that they come to the court with an ideology, and that ideology affects their decisions. There are some things that kind of seem more no-brainer to be like, oh, they're not going to strip away birthright citizenship because that's so obviously in the Constitution. And I would challenge that assumption, because it's not that that's so legally obviously wrong to take away. It's that in their own system of thinking, the way they've been trained, the real value of precedent to them isn't just as precedent. It's just like, oh, there are a lot of obstacles here that I kind of like think might be correct before I can reach my outcome to things. And that's how they're trained to think. they think in this system, the game is you have to use these different precedents and such. But what they don't really acknowledge very much is how their own ideology affects their efforts to manipulate that precedent. And I think that's what's really, I mean, you're not going to change that in them, but I think it's really important for people to understand that it's not quite as blatant as, Alito wants to strip away all women's rights. It's Alito has a notion that I'm actually an objective, independent judicial thinker. I don't have a preconceived ideology. And while you may not change that in Alito, you can certainly change that in people and their understanding of what those judicial candidates bring. I mean, the whole idea of the vetting process in confirmation hearings is completely useless exercise at this point. I mean, ever since, Robert Bork, the standard playbook now is to sort of answer nothing in those questions. So no one can actually get a sense of what your ideology is. And then you can do whatever you want, once you get on the court. That's a completely broken, pointless system. I mean, Congress, Senate has abdicated its power there. So if people understand, we need to figure out ways where we can get at ideology. We need to elect people who aren't afraid to use their votes to say no if they say this person's expressed views looks like a big problem for a lot of things we care about. And you have to vote no rather than being worried that Trump's going to primary you. I mean, that's all the political leverage that, that has always been there, but they make it so blatant right now. And the problem is without people understanding that, without people making politicians pay a price for not standing up to it, then it's very hard to get the system back working with its sort of checks and balances. I mean, we often talk about, what a messy system the democracy is. And of course, that's really very frustrating, that it's messy, it takes forever. But that's also the safety net, because if you give the viewpoints the ability to fight each other, gum things up, it prevents one powerful momentum, one powerful mob leader or personality from getting everything done exactly the way they wanted. And that's what I think we have to let people take strength from, is that messiness, the frustration. That's actually a strength for it, rather than just being frustrated. That Democratic leadership sucks, they can't get anything done. That's fine to express that frustration. Elect people who can get things done. But the fact that the process is so sloppy, that's actually really important and a good thing.
Well, it's a great thing. And, democracy, and we've heard this in the past. And I mean, you just said it, democracy is messy, and people have said that in the past. It's common knowledge. And the concerns I have are that, well, if it was already messy to begin with, having two Trump administrations makes it even messier. But wouldn't you say not in the best way, only for the fact that it's not like it's messy from the standpoint of, okay, but you're still, at the end of the day, you're going to have your three, co-equal branches of government, but one branch is not going to usurp another branch. I mean, they're co-equal. We're not going to have it where one branch is more important than the other. They all serve out their functions and they all serve a place in our democratic system. I mean, that's what we always knew. But then when Trump came along, he basically expanded the powers of the executive branch. I remember an interview I watched with Barry Goldwater, and he was a Republican, and he was concerned about Lyndon Baines Johnson expanding the executive branch powers. And I look at that interview and I said to myself, wow, relatively speaking, maybe that was a time where, okay, President Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon Baines Johnson wanted and he felt inclined on behalf of the American people to make sure that the Kennedy agenda, that those key piece of legislation, whether it was the Voter Rights Act, whether it's our Civil Rights Act, that those things had to occur. Getting a man on the moon in 1969, winning the space race, standing up to communism. And now I look at what we consider today to be, or what the Trump administration is doing, and what we have to stomach, unfortunately, is that they're not expanding the executive branch in the best interest of the country. Maybe you could have looked at a time during the Great Recession or during even COVID, when desperate times called for desperate measures, where, whether it was President Obama, who had to bail out the banks and bail out the auto industry, or even President Biden having to correct supply chain disruption, his administration having to, do everything they can to try to fix our supply chains at the ports on the coast. But now with President Trump, I mean, he's expanding the executive branch to his own benefit. He's expanding the executive branch to really hurt this country in more ways than one, where we're not going to be able to, politically, it feels like anyway, survive until next year when the midterms happen. And you hope that, to your point about the redistricting, and now you see whether it's Democratic states or Republican led states, that they want to try to offset either losing seats or gaining seats, whomever you talk to. And I applaud what Governor Newsom is trying to do. He has made it very clear to his constituents. He's made it very clear to the residents of California that we're only doing this one time because of what Texas illegally doing, because they're complicit with the Trump administration, because they fear that with Trump's poll numbers, they fear that the Republican Party is going to lose the House and potentially the Senate. If the Democrats control the House, it's going to make President Trump a lame duck president the last 2 years. With the extension of the executive branch, or the expansion of powers, is really going to really test our democracy. But also, I hope that people don't misunderstand why certain states are redistricting, to your point earlier, because they're doing it to save democracy.
Yeah, I think an important point to follow up on about our discussion with democracy being messy is a important part of the sort of authoritarian dictatorship notion is to make it not messy, is to make it more, quote, efficient. And you see that in a lot of what the Trump administration did. I mean, even the debacle that was Doge, let's just get in there and kind of like get rid of people, stop things, cut them willy-nilly, it looks like. But the unifying theme is, yeah, this is too cumbersome, it's too messy. We want to be able to just give an order and it gets done. And to do that, you really have to streamline things and get rid of the agencies, get rid of the protections, get rid of the career workers who are part of that institutional wisdom and history. So that really goes a lot to it. You know how deeply ingrained is the messiness for the good of democracy when you see that people who don't want a democracy want to get rid of that messiness. Let's make it my way or the highway, make that very explicitly clear. And I think with the Supreme Court and the expansion of the executive power, the so-called theory of the unitary executive, that again goes back to this long period of the ideology of these people. I mean, they have it ingrained in their minds that there's a theoretical reason for why you want to have more deference to the executive. And I'm sure they would all pass a lie detector test if they said, it's not we personally like Trump and want to support his agenda. We just think there's too much encroachment on the executive. And most importantly, we don't want to be the ones who are encroaching on the executive because our job is supposed to be just the judicial branch. We have some notion of what that entails. And it's very important to someone like Chief Justice Roberts that he's not seen as, for political reasons, encroaching on the executive's authority. Problem with that is, please live in this universe. Take a look at what life is actually like for people and understand that your ideology there is fake there. It does not work as applied to what's actually happening to people. So that doesn't mean you have to adopt the ideology that you consider to be left, but it would really be important to strip away this facade that you're not being ideological. And I think that is the big problem here with these institutions. Same thing when we look at what happens in Congress, the leadership for the Democrats, being very careful, being worried about what will the precedent be. Same thing even, with Newsom saying we're only doing this on a limited basis. We're not just declaring all out war with redistricting. Well, maybe that needs to happen first. I mean, one can foresee a situation where across the U.S., gloves are off on redistricting. It's just completely wacko. Whoever's in power, whoever the governor is, just does it that way. And you could reach a point there where, the backswing is so bad that at a future point, both sides get together and say, yeah, this is like really not working for us. We need to actually get together on some bipartisan agreement about how to treat the redistricting. But to do there, you're not going to get there while one side's in power and you, the minority side, keep on saying, well, we don't want to do anything that might affect things badly in the future. You first have to get back the political power. You really have to be able to fight back in a winning kind of way to get yourself back on the even keel. And I think for me, the great attraction of seeing what folks like Newsham are doing is that they are fighting back, because you got to first get back to equal footing before you can take the view of what's the best thing to do for the future.
Yes, and you counsel and mentor a lot of students, and people look to you and they're inspired by you, Shannon, your illustrious career and everything you've done for this country as a private citizen, but also, working in the public sector too as a private citizen. And, as a lawyer, are you concerned that the type of legal training that students are getting today in law school is different than when you were coming up? My father's a lawyer too. He went to the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. And, he graduated from law school in 1977. So he always tells me when we have these, legal discussions, and, he has watched you on CNN, and, Joey and Ellie, we talk every night about, what we saw or what we heard, and we talk politics, we talk the law. He's a lawyer. I'm not the lawyer, but because I've been around him my whole life, growing up, I mean, I have been around lawyers besides my father, and now speaking to several of them on my podcast, where I understand, the opinions of lawyers and just how they think. I mean, it's always fact based, right? Like a journalist, my background is journalism and mass communication. So, like a journalist, lawyers, they go with facts, but journalists like to report what's going on. And, the best journalists, they'll always report what they know. And then if anything changes, they report again and say, okay, breaking news. This is what just came in. This is what has changed. Lawyers, it's always about not so much what they believe, it's what they can prove, right? And with that premise, knowing that what we see today with the redistricting and what is to come for the 2026 midterms, or what students are being trained or what they're being taught in law schools, are the universities, have they caught up to the fact of this new phenomenon in the Trump era and the MAGA movement, where when it comes time to, lawyers, if they don't believe in, the politics of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. So I guess I'm really speaking to maybe independent minded or even left leaning, aspiring judges or lawyers or whomever. Are they going to be well prepared? Are the universities up to date on, okay, yes, you're going to get your 3 years of law school, and we're going to teach you everything from constitutional law to torts to criminal law to, making sure that you all are prepared when you go out and start, representing your own clients. But the conversation I have with my dad, or the conversations I've had over the years with him, is that so much, because of the Trump administration, it's almost like the rule of law is essentially, becoming non-existent, from the standpoint of, because there are precedents happening, and not in the way that you would think, that there are precedents happening that never could have been contemplated, under a Trump administration 10, 15, 25, 50 years ago, or even going back to the founding fathers who founded our country. So are students capable, or are they going to be well prepared to be, living out their next, 60 to 80 years, living in the 21st century, given everything that we've really dealt with in the first 25 years of the 21st century?
That's a really great and important question, and I think it's goes much deeper and broader than just law school training. I think that on the rule of law thing, what I think people need to understand is that there is no independent rule of law that just sits out there like in a glowing receptacle that we need to access. The rule of law is made by us human beings. Just like when people like to say, "Oh, the government does this, the government does that." I'm like, "Yeah, hey, I worked in the government. The government is just people in there. It's not like this other thing that sits there as the government." Same thing with the rule of law. The rule of law is being created all the time. It's being reinforced. It's being adjusted. So that's the first thing, is stop thinking of it as this mystical, holy grail thing that sits out there that can be revered, by people. The other aspect of it is on the education. Is right now, I think it's still okay, because it takes a while to strip away the education foundations and to basically indoctrinate people. And you see that's the effort that's being made with the Trump administration. I mean, kind of gutting the Department of Education, but more importantly, trying to control curriculum, right? You're going to refer to everything as it's DI, it's woke, it's hurting America, removing historical exhibits from museums because they don't, quote, glorify America enough. I mean, all those bad things that happen in America are part of America. It's our ability to look at them, study them, and remember them that makes us great, not pretending they didn't happen. That makes us very weak that way. That fight is really important because that is the future training, the future way of thinking for young people. Even what they're doing in the military academy is, very disturbing, trying to take away any kind of like review of historical precedents. So like authoritarianism is really this indoctrination that's attempting to happen. And it can't happen overnight. I mean, the analogy I like to use from my parents' experience is in China under Mao, there's something called the Cultural Revolution, not the original Communist Revolution, but Mao was having a political difficulty. So he kind of unleashed this cadre of young loyalists upon the country, the Red Guards, to basically criticize and ultimately beat, rape, murder people in the name of we're making sure we go back to the foundations of being correctly revolutionary. From an education standpoint, what that resulted in was a generation of what they call empty heads in China. Like the education system was destroyed for that generation. So there was no critical thinking. They didn't learn how to actually do things properly or to think about things. And that's terribly dangerous for the country. Great for the dictator to stay in power, terrible for the country in terms of what it can do in the future. And that's something that you're raising, I think, is so critical. That has to be protected. Everything from grade school to college to professional training, you have to protect that ability for people to do critical thinking, to understand, look at different points of view, look at bad things in history, look at good things and analyze that. And that's really step number one. You want to get rid of that, simplify everything. You don't want people to be thinking about those things.
Sure, sure. And what do you teach your students, and what do you tell them about, just from everything that you just laid out for my audience and me? What do you tell them about, not losing hope, or to continue being inspired to follow, the legal way of being trained at the university level, or just going out and being taught the way that you're supposed to represent your clients? And, obviously it's about really putting your best foot forward, or helping the clients that you represent, for them to succeed under your representation, that you are going to be advocating for them, and that you are going to be able to, if you're obviously representing a plaintiff, it's a different type of training than, for someone to be representing a defendant. And, that in itself, that's two different schools of thought, or just two different ways of looking at the law. But when people are seeing that the president of the United States, because it's all about him, it's all about his interests, it's all about using the law to his advantage, and going after and being very demonstrative, or being very much outspoken about wanting to go after political opponents, and being somebody who wants to create that political divide and has no interest whatsoever for unifying the country, is that going to dissuade, potentially aspiring law students to say, what's the point? Because if the MAGA movement continues, and if, let's say, a Democrat can't win in 2028, or even let alone that there's no blue wave next year, or there's not a blue wave next year in the 2026 midterms, I almost feel like a Democrat has to win in 2028. In 2026, the Democrats have to, orchestrate a blue wave. So things go back to what they were under the Biden era, and even pre-Trump, during the Obama era, and pre-Obama era, because these two administrations of Trump really has changed the trajectory, and really changed the course of human history, if you will, on so many different levels. But as it pertains to this discussion of, the law and the rule of law, and talking about the Supreme Court, and talking about what democracy has now gone through and being tested to the brink. So what do you tell your students? How do you tell them not to lose hope, given everything that we've talked about in our conversation and everything that we've seen that this Trump administration and Donald Trump personally has inflicted on, and knowing that, you know, that Merrick Garland wasn't quick enough to get his special counsel in place to go after the Trump administration, because exonerating 1,500 of the most hardened criminals on January 6th, or the classified documents case where he willfully, kept them and not giving it back to the government that owned those documents, or trying to buy 11,000 votes in the state of Georgia and putting political pressure on people like a Jeff Duncan, who now is running for, governor of Georgia as a Democrat. And we only saw the Alvin Bragg case in the state of New York actually, come to fruition to reach its finality. But at the end of the day, the 3 of the 4 big cases that were looming during Trump's, period when he was a private citizen again, the fact of the matter is that he really got off scot-free. So what does that tell the young lawyers out there that said, well, I can represent my client to the best of my ability and fight for his or her rights and really put forth a great case, but maybe not in the immediate future. But if this MAGA movement continues, or if we continue to see a very partisan Supreme Court, and that things over time continue to go down a bad path, what does that say to the rule of law? Although it's like you said, it's not this mythical thing that's out there. I mean, the rule of law essentially is what it is. It's like the gold standard of our American justice system, but it's being tested every day, Shan. So long story short, what do you tell students not to lose hope in that regard?
I think you have to look to history and understand that the rule of law is something which is being shaped every single day. So any effort that you make in the legal area is helping to shape that. All these lower court victories are enormously important for the benefit of the democracy, but they are also, again, only able to happen because of many generations of lawyers who have stood up and fought for these, advocated for it. That's how these lower court victories can happen right now. That's how it has served as a guardrail on the abuses of the Trump administration. And that's what's important to emphasize to the young people. It's not to have an apathetic attitude of, nothing's going to matter in the end. It's mattering every single day. It's happening right now. And that's what folks need to learn. I mean, when I was teaching undergrad, I told them my goal, I can't do this by myself in one class, but my goal is to give you some critical analytical capability so you can look at things yourself and have confidence to make some decisions on your own about what you're seeing out there. There's a lot of talk today about how in the age of the internet, it's so much better. There's unlimited viewpoints. People can really make their own decisions. But, many people don't make their own decisions. They just happen to glom onto someone's view or, right-wing Facebook groups that they're following. They're not really making their own decisions. They're just sort of parroting what they see. And what's important to instill in students, young people, is it's fine. You can be exposed to those things, but you have to have the tools to start to make decisions. And that's why in school, you want to encourage people to dissent from each other, to disagree, because that forces them to think ideally why they believe something. And that's really what the education's all about. And if you let that kind of go by the wayside, it's a big problem. One thing I like to remind people about the legal system here is this is an adversarial system. I mean, it's based on that idea, and maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. It's not like an inquisitorial system. It's the idea that you have these 2 white knights on chargers and they fight each other, and whoever wins is telling the truth. Now, logically, there's no particular reason. It's just who was the better fighter there. But that's the system we believe in. So therefore, you got to look at due process, because that means same type of horse, same type of armor. That's what that's all about. And again, going back to what the MAGA movement wants to do is we talk about them in the media a lot as, rhetoric's too heated, it's too adversarial. They actually don't want to be adversarial. They simply don't want any opposition. They don't like that idea of 2 equally armed champions fighting each other. They simply want to say, I tell you what to do. And so that's what's really important to instill in young people is our system is messy, it's adversarial, people get to fight over their viewpoints. What does the Trump administration, what do people like that want to do historically? What do dictators want to do? They don't want that fight. They just want to tell you what to do. And to do that, they have to first fight to get to that point. But once they get there, there's not going to be any fighting anymore. It's not like what Trump was saying in a sort of a cryptic kind of way, which is just vote this one time. After that, you won't have to vote anymore. That's really kind of like the same idea.
It's so true. And, you raise all valid points. I totally agree with what you're saying. And it's almost as if like, just how you said it so well, Shan, that, democracy is messy, right? But it's almost ironically, they want to take the messiness out of democracy, where they would rather just be our way or the highway. And, it's our viewpoints and our viewpoints alone. And it's our course of action that we are going to stand by. And if anybody wants to get in our way, that, there's hell to pay. And it's really sad. It's really unfortunate for our American citizenry. And, when I was talking to Joey Jackson, your colleague, fellow CNN legal analyst, he quotes the Bible. He's a faith-filled person. And the word that matters most to him is righteousness. Where is the righteousness in the Trump administration? And he's a big advocate, and I believe every lawyer should be, and I know you're a big advocate of it, of due process. And you talked about it. If you don't allow non-citizens, even because they are protected by our U.S. Constitution, to have due process, if you're taking due process away from people, if you're taking away freedom of speech from people, if you're taking away their abilities to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then what is the point of the MAGA movement? You can't say, or Donald Trump shouldn't be saying, oh, we're the hottest country, and everything that we do economically or domestically or our foreign affairs, it's, this is the best course of action. But it's not. I mean, just because Donald Trump says so doesn't mean it is. But for whatever reason, the sycophants in the MAGA movement, the people who are complicit, they look to him as a false god, and they look at him as, oh, if he's saying it, it must be true. Well, then, Shan, from someone like you, from your perspective as a lawyer, and who shares many perspectives of other lawyers as well, whether you're left, right, or center, there are some common principles that all lawyers believe in. And that, I mean, if you throw the rule of law out the window, then what's the point of the legal profession? What is the point of students going to law school in this country? So I really believe, and I really hope that, let's, protect the rule of law first, right? And in order to do that, we talked about it. If there's a blue wave that's going to happen next year, the Democrats and independents and any conservatives that want to join them, they all have to get on the same page. And whether you're a lawyer, a doctor, or whether you are a business owner, or whether you're in government, or whomever you might be, whatever your passions are, whatever your pursuits are, to contribute to society and be, good stewards of society, and, give back to your communities, or whatever motivates you to be a good family person, to be a family man, family woman, to be, good people, whatever you aspire to, we have to have one message. And so in the last couple of questions that I have, what does Shan Wu, when he wakes up in the morning, what do you think about on a daily basis? I mean, what are your first thoughts about the country every day? Where do you think we're falling short? Where do you think that we're over excelling? Or where do you think that we just have to get to in a place where we can have civil conversations and civil discussions?
I think what people need to be reminded of and to keep in the forefront of their own minds is that what we are fighting for is the right to disagree. And it's more than the lofty idea of its First Amendment freedom of expression, which is important. But when you talk about it that way, it sometimes becomes very kind of theoretical and removed. It's really the right to disagree is fundamental to how the system of government works to protect us as individuals, so that you don't have a dictator who doesn't let you disagree. That's why it matters, the freedom of speech, is once you take that away, then whoever happens to have the biggest gun at that moment gets to tell everybody else what to do. And so that, I think, is so important for people to understand, is we got to fight back to where we're allowed to disagree. It's not even a question of having civil discussion. I mean, by all means, there should never be violence in discussions. That's like a no-brainer. But I also think there's a lot of manipulation going on from the right that it's this heated rhetoric, that's the cause of things. I mean, their rhetoric is ridiculously heated, and it's not, I don't want to digress too much. This idea of the radicalization of people that's happening. I mean, when you look at these individual famous assassins, there are other factors going on than just being radicalized through some literature. So that's a little bit of a false narrative. By all means, no one should incite violence, but the freedom to have that rhetoric, to disagree with each other, is first step. Second step is the civil discussion part. How do you get young people, how do you get people to actually think about what their beliefs are and why they believe that way? Why do you want to believe in Trump, but anything that Biden says, is completely a lie? I mean, why do you make that choice? And there are deep-rooted factors in people's circumstances why they make choices like that. That's the kind of thing that I think about each day. How do we explain that to people? It's not just reaching out across, the dinner table kind of thing. And let's talk to my MAGA uncle. It's much broader than that to figure out, how can you get people to think in the future, particularly young people, about why they like certain things. And that's, I think, the critical thinking that has to happen.
Absolutely. And even in the wake of Charlie Kirk's tragic, horrific passing, that whether it was his wife who publicly said in 100,000 person stadium in Glendale, Arizona, that she forgives his killer, or whether it was Charlie Kirk who said a lot of controversial, he was very contentious. He said a lot of hurtful, offensive things that, Joe Walsh and I discussed in my previous interview today on my podcast that, should never have been said, because it really went against, fact-based evidence, or it's okay to have an opinion, right? I mean, again, Charlie Kirk, may rest in peace. I didn't agree with the vast majority of things that he talked about. And I certainly didn't agree with all the controversial, hurtful things that he said that was full of hatred and contempt of other people who are so innocent, and that we're not looking to have these arguments with Charlie Kirk. But you say to yourself, okay, when you look at the way he lived, it's different than now post passing, meaning that I was listening to an African-American pastor that said you could abhor the way that Charlie Kirk died, but you certainly shouldn't, and I'm just paraphrasing, but you certainly shouldn't forgive, or in a sense, maybe you could forgive, but not forget the terrible, hurtful things he said, and don't try to conflate both issues. So because we saw the president at that moment, in that pivotal moment, said that he basically hates his political opponents and he doesn't wish his political opponents good whatsoever. When you have the leader of the free world saying that, I mean, that says a lot, Shannon, of how could we get to that civil discussion?
Yeah, and again, that goes back to our discussion about the MAGAs want it simple. They don't want it to be complicated. People are being fired, canceled, because they're capable of addressing these 2 points, which is, in life, the guy might have said terrible things that are very bad and hurtful, and this terrible way they died. You're not allowed to bring those two up. It's got to be very simple. Either he is a saint and a martyr, or you are somebody who is helping to kill the person. It's that ridiculously oversimplified view of the world, because the point of it is to make sure that you only can agree with one side. That's what the problem is with this. And, the one positive thing that I feel about Charlie Kirk, who actually didn't pay that much attention to prior to his, his murder, is that, say what you will about him, but he was going to talk to people, and he made money off of it, obviously, but, he was willing to put himself out there with potentially hostile audiences and debate and argue and talk to them, and that was a good thing to do. And I think as this atmosphere increases that you can't do that unless you're spouting the right line, that's a huge problem. And that's really kind of a takeaway, which is that's sort of forgotten. They put him up as a martyr, as a saint, everything he did was right. That's obviously wrong. Okay. But one thing he was doing that we can do more of is, he wasn't afraid to go out and talk to people that disagreed with him and have fights with them verbally. That we need more of.
Right, exactly. And final question is that what can we learn from a relationship building standpoint? Because this is the relationship building and team environment podcast. And I believe that all the challenges and obstacles and problems that our country faces, that the world faces, and that we're trying to get to a better place in society, and pray and hope that we're better humans tomorrow than we were today as a society collectively, but also individually. But there's various degrees of, people who are, considered to be either public servants or people who are, considered to be people who you look up to or admire, or trendsetters, or, we look to celebrity culture, we look to our politicians, or we look to business owners, or we look to anybody who is doing good in the world, and we try to emulate that. And with my podcast, I hope that every time I interview somebody, that people have a great experience, that they felt safe and comfortable to talk about these issues on an open forum and on an open platform. And because I get a lot of positive feedback, it tells me that I'm doing something right and that I'm contributing to society. So it makes me feel good to be hosting this podcast. But I also have no problem, having differences of opinion, or maybe challenging my guests in a very respectful way, but in a very constructive way, not in a negative way, being able to challenge them in a sense of asking these questions. Or sometimes my questions, as you can tell, are multifaceted, or, have multi layers to them, so that I can really dig deep with my guests, and whether it's you, Shan, or others, to give thought-provoking answers. And so where could we get to, last question, where could we get to in society to be better relationship builders? And what are your final thoughts on relationship building, the team environment, for my audience at home?
I think relationship building starts with yourself. It starts with your relationship to yourself. There's that analogy I used to like to use with my kids growing up about on the airplanes when they say, put your own oxygen mask on first, right, before you can help anybody else. And for that aspect, I mean, the people that inspire me the most are oftentimes people who have engaged in self-reflection and have evolved over time. And that can be people we've never heard of before that you encounter in daily life, or very famous figures. I mean, I think of Robert F. Kennedy, who really underwent what seemed to be a great sea change in his reflection and personality after the loss of his brother. That was a huge impact upon him. I even recently, on one of the videos I did, was talking about the analogy to George Wallace, who was the victim of that assassination attempt, very much of a, pro-segregation, insulted the Black community. And late in life, having suffered a great deal and had some time away from politics to reflect, actually apologized to the Black community. So I think it's examples like that that we can look to, of people who have had very strong beliefs and they reflected upon them to think about themselves, to challenge themselves. And I think that's where the relationship building starts, is your relationship to yourself, to think about, why do I believe these things? Why do these things make me angry? Why do these things make me happy? And understanding that, that's the first foundation for how you can better relate to other people.
And for your children, you mentioned your children. I'm sure your kids growing up, and with your parents too, a relationship building was instilled mightily.
Oh, yes. No, I hope so with my children. So far, so good. But certainly, I think with my parents, I definitely got that sense from them as people who had lived across a historical background of huge changes happening post World War II, China's government changing, coming here with no extended family. I really saw how important that was, the relationship to themselves, in order to instill a sense of security with me. I grew up here with no grandparents, no cousins, just the three of us. And yet, in hindsight, I never felt lonely, didn't feel insecure about anything. I think that's because they had a very strong sense of themselves, and that's really important.
And with your kids, what do you tell them every day? What do I'm sure you tell them everything will be okay.
Yeah, I think when those questions come up, I always tend to talk a little bit about the bigger picture. Well, when the children are young and they're very worried about something that may happen, I just want to impress upon them and other folks that the historical context of things, and that's the value of seeing history, that there have been many, many ups and downs and cycles, and we can learn from all those. And particularly for young people, it feels like, one of my student defense clients, I'm always telling the parents this in the first phone calls: you got to make sure they're supported and are told, including by me, because I'm not a parent to them, that this is going to be really stressful, but it's going to pass. And you have to have the perspective to know that one day this is in your rear view mirror. And I think that's the most important thing for people's hope and confidence is you have to give them some context. Other things have happened, terrible things have happened, and it's all part of the history. And this is going to be part of the history at some point too.
Yes. Well, on that note, Shan, I really want to thank you again for being with me today on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building and a team environment. My 90th guest on the podcast. We touched upon a lot of important topics, topics of our time, the things that we're seeing, the things that we're experiencing, having to live through another Trump administration, and really trying to be as respectful of this whole process from the standpoint of, yes, we have our opinions, yes, we have our thoughts, yes, we have our criticisms, but really trying to take, an objective lens. But we're humans. We're always going to be subjective. We're always going to challenge. We're always going to, be in a position where we want our voices to be heard. And if we see that something is wrong, we have to speak out and say, hey, that's wrong. And if we hear something that we don't believe is factual and we do the research and we realize it's not factual, we have to call it out. And, there are people in society who unfortunately have bent the knee to this administration. And for people like you and me, we don't understand that life. We don't understand why people do the things that they do, but they're going to do them anyways. And unfortunately, they're going to do it for various reasons. But at the end of the day, they're doing it probably for personal interest, or also in a position where, they also don't want to be criticized themselves. And if they feel that, hey, it's going to be somebody's problem one day, I just got to get through the day, make the decision to move on. Well, that's not the way life is, because every action, there'll be a reaction. So I'm so thankful and grateful that you could speak with my audience and me and about relationship building and team environment, because I say this about all my guests, that he or she are elite relationship builders, and you are an elite relationship builder. You've had an illustrious career. You've done so much good for society, whether it's representing clients, working for the former Attorney General Janet Reno, whether it's counseling and mentoring your students, appearing on CNN and providing legal commentary. Thank you so much again, Shan, for your time. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to many more conversations in the future.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was a pleasure to be here and an honor to be on the program. So look forward to future conversations too.
I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.
See you soon.
Take care.